Hello.
Adam, moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies per estar aquí. I per finalitzar aquesta jornada, que no és fàcil finalitzar la jornada, però aquí tenim molt aguante i estarem superatents i t'aprofitarem. L'Adam Burley ens explicarà en què consisteix i com s'aplica l'entorn psicològicament informat i quins avantatges té per l'atenció social i les persones i entitats implicades. Moltes gràcies.
That is loud, isn't it? Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name's check slide. My name's Adam Burley. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist, and I work in Scotland, which, after Spain, is the second most sunny country in the world, as this picture is proof of. I want to thank the organisation for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be here, and I want to thank everyone who's spoken before for covering all the stuff, the technical stuff, so I can just sort of talk about relationships, which is the thing I like talking about the most. I want to apologise to the interpreter right now in that I tend to speak quite quickly. I'm going to try and go a bit slower, but my apologies in advance for that, and for anything that you don't get, you can ask me questions afterwards. I'm going to try and get through the slides relatively quickly to leave time for questions, because as we've been hearing, these things are best done in relation to one another rather than me just banging on like this. So I want to talk a little bit about relationships, I want to talk a bit about adversity, and a little bit about what I think I mean by sort of a psychologically informed approach in particular areas of healthcare in relation to people who have been experiencing homelessness or exclusion in other sorts of ways. But I'm going to start with relationships, because I think, despite the fact that certainly in Scotland they're more in the language of the work that we do, I still think it's something that needs to be revisited in terms of thinking about what we actually mean when we talk about relationships and how important they are. I'm going to start with external relationships and quote a chap called Donald Winnicott, who is a British psychoanalyst. I'm sure you've all read him extensively. He made the mistake of not coming up with a catchy phrase like attachment theory, like his contemporary Bowlby did. And everyone remembers Bowlby, don't they? Because he came up with a catchy title like attachment theory. And Winnicott isn't so famous, except he's famous with a very small f for coming up with sort of idiosyncratic phrases like this, like there's no such thing as a baby. Which might come as a surprise to some of you if you've either got a baby or seen a baby. For those of you who haven't, it's this one. Not to be confused with this one, although they're quite similar in other sorts of ways. So what does he mean by there's no such thing as a baby? Well, I think what he's talking about is an idea that if you've ever seen a baby, certainly when we got our first baby home, we brought it home in the car seat, put it on the table, and had a good look at it. And we were like, what the hell do we do now? Because actually they're almost entirely useless, aren't they? They can't walk, they can't talk, they can't control their sphincters, they can't do very much, actually, can they? In fact, in the sort of language of Winnicott's sort of 1950s, slightly euphemistic language, if you don't look after them, if they don't get into relationship with you very quickly, they will no longer be a going concern. And I assume by that he means they won't be alive anymore. They won't be psychologically alive. They won't be physically alive. They need to get into relationship with you to survive in some very basic sort of sense, really. And so I think the extension for that for Winnicott is an idea that this never stops, actually, that we are most alive. In fact, our aliveness, our growth, is dependent upon our capacity to form and maintain relationships with other people, not just in the first moments of life, but absolutely across the lifespan. It's something that's sort of common across the piece, really. And as we've heard earlier on, I'm not going to go into that, when things go well like that, things tend to go well. When we have nice, stable, healthy relationships, then some of our life outcomes tend to be all right in some basic way. I'm going to try and introduce the idea of internal relationships, because I think they're quite an important idea to get across, using the medium of Calvin and Hobbes. I'm sure you've all read Calvin and Hobbes as well as Winnicott, the two classics of this area. Anyone not read Calvin and Hobbes? Where have you been? So for those who haven't read Calvin and Hobbes, Calvin is the little boy. He's about 6, we think. And Hobbes is his pet tiger. He's not a real tiger. It's okay. He's just a stuffed tiger. But when there's no adults in the room, he's very much alive. And he's very much alive in Calvin's world. I'm going to read it for those at the back of the plane. I'll read it because you might not be able to read it. In this first panel, Calvin is waking Hobbes up. And he's saying, "Hey, Hobbes, it's bedtime." And Hobbes is like, "Oh, I wouldn't want to have slept through that." And then Calvin says, "Well, I wonder why we dream when we sleep. Do our brains just get bored? I wonder why we don't just plain sleep." And Hobbes, ever the philosopher, says, "Well, I think we dream so we don't have to be apart for so long. If we're in each other's dreams, we can play together all night." And Calvin's like, "Hey, yeah, that's cool, man." And he says, "Well, I'll see you in a few minutes, old buddy." And Hobbes is like, "I'll be there." And then in this panel, they're sort of falling asleep. So they're falling apart from each other into sort of unconsciousness. And then in the final panel, they're separate. They're actually unconscious of each other. But I guess the idea is that I'm trying to get across rather laboriously, is that in this panel, there's now 2 Hobbeses and 2 Calvins, because Calvin has a Hobbes in his mind, and Hobbes has a Calvin in his mind. And they may be doing very different things. They may be playing completely different games in each other's minds. And I suppose it's the idea to sort of think that our minds are constructed by the relational experiences that we have. And there might be an idea even to say that our minds are relationally constructed, that we have parts of ourselves that are in relation to each other, none of which we chose. Choice is an important word, just as a little aside, because certainly in the area I've been working for the last couple of decades, choice is often used as a sort of way of getting out of doing things. So we often say, oh, this person's choosing to not turn up to their appointments, or they're choosing to take drugs, or they're choosing to rough sleep, like in some way we all chose our minds. Anyone here choose their mind? Anyone? No. Good. I'm glad we've established that. So the idea might be that our minds are made for us based on the experiences that we have, the relationships that we get into, which we have very little choice over. And our internal world starts to be populated by the relationships that we've had in the external world. And if that's all gone well, if our external world has all been nice and full of Calvin and Hobbes, then we might go on to have lots of other Calvin and Hobbes in our future life and have lots of relationships and have no real anxieties in the business of making connections with other sort of human beings. And I'll come on to talk a bit about when that hasn't been the case and what that's sort of like. Is everyone comfortable with the idea of having an internal world? Does everyone have internal worlds in Spain? I assume so. It's a bit like the sort of idea of, part of you thought, oh, I should probably go to this conference today, and maybe another part of you thought, I could probably just bunk off, actually, no one would notice, there's going to be lots of people there, and I could just stay at home and watch Netflix, some good stuff on. And then either you all had to come, or you all had to stay at home. Like you couldn't send a bit of you to the conference while a bit of you stayed at home, and that's the problem with having parts of ourselves. They're often in sort of conflict with each other, and we have to go with the majority sometimes, and sometimes it's not always the thing that we want to do, really. But to sort of slightly over-egg the relationship bit, I think one way of thinking about how important relationships are is a bit like they're the psychological equivalent of breathing. And most of us have been breathing since we arrived at this conference today. In fact, most of us have been breathing, if we really think about it, since we were born. And we're so good at it and so skilled at it that we don't even notice we're doing it. We don't get home after today and go, another successful day of breathing. Aren't I clever? We just do it, don't we? And we can breathe while we're talking and while we're going to conferences and driving cars and giving presentations and doing all sorts of things. It's extraordinary, really. But if you've ever seen anybody choke, or you've ever had breathing problems, or know somebody who's had severe breathing problems, you'll suddenly realize that breathing is the whole shooting match. It's everything. So if you're not breathing, nothing else really matters at that point. It's the end of things. Breathing is that fundamental. And I might argue, depending on what day it is, that relationships are just as important, that they are something that if they are going well, if our heads are filled with lots of Calvin and Hobbes and we can breathe through life making connections and making friends and colleagues, we may not even notice that we're doing it. It might just be this sort of relational substrate that sits below everything that we do. We might think that we got to where we are today because we're really clever or we did well at university or something, and ignore and not really understand that it's got something to do with our capacity to form and maintain relationships. But when relationships choke, again, which we'll come on to when they might choke, and we've heard quite a lot about that this morning, when people choke in relationships all over the place, it can be catastrophic, just as catastrophic and life-ending as choking is in breathing. We talked about mortality in the place I used to be based, which was a GP practice for people experiencing homelessness. The average age of death was 38 in a cohort of about 600 people, the capital city of a pretty well-established developed country. 38. It's a very, very life-limiting condition to not be able to relate particularly well. And so what causes relational choking? Well, all sorts of things, I think, really. And again, we've heard a lot today, and I'm not going to repeat it, about all the sort of different variations in which people can experience trauma, adversity, mistreatment, neglect in relation to others, and how that might then become internalized such that they have an internal world that is actually populated by their external world. And of course, they didn't choose their external world, and if their external world was full of violence and threat and worry and abuse and neglect, then it would be strange if their internal world didn't have those sorts of relational dynamics within them as well. As one lady put it, who I worked with for a long time, we wrote a paper together, actually, on Moana. Has everyone seen the film Moana? Disney film? These are the classics, man. Anyway, I can send the paper around. It's very good. But it was her ideas about, she told me that Moana was a film about trauma, which had been slightly lost on me until that point, but it turns out it is, actually. Well, certainly, it could be interpreted that way. But she came up with a nice phrase of, when we were talking about something of the ways in which she could present when she was at her most anxious, which could be, at times, quite violent, quite aggressive, quite abusive. She certainly had a capacity to be she was really bright, she could be really cleverly abusive towards reception staff or support workers or a range of people. But she had a lovely insight, which was, the thing is, Adam, you can only defend yourself with the knives that were thrown at you, which I think is a really nice way of sort of capturing something of the internalization of the external experience. I'm just going to say that again, just in case it got lost in translation. You can only defend yourself with the knives that were thrown at you. That's all you have. And certainly for her experience, that's all she had. It's not like she could have gone next door when she was 3 because she thought her parents were crap. So I'll just go next door and see what's happening there. She didn't know her parents were crap. She didn't find out till much later on. They were just her parents. She didn't know any different, because none of us do know any different, don't we? We just have to experience and relate to the experiences that we're having in some way. The term I kind of want to really use to cover this in a very general sense is an idea of a relational injury. I'm not sure what the translation of that would be, but an injury to the person's capacity to form and maintain relationships across the lifespan in ways that allow their emotional, psychological, and physical needs to be met. Injuries, I think, are much easier conceptualized or visualized when they are physical injuries. The reason this talk is called Shining a Light on the Invisible is because so much of relational activity is invisible. You can't see it. Like, we're having a relationship just now, but where is it? Like, no one can point to it. It's sort of there somewhere, or between me and all the other people, between other people, but it's not visible in a way that a physical injury is really visible. So when you take a physical injury to the hospital, this isn't my son's arm, but my son smashed his arm. Can anyone guess what he smashed it on? Monkey bars, yes, monkey bars. I'm sure you have monkey bars in Spain. All kids, you go to the hospital with a broken arm with a kid, and they go, monkey bars or trampoline? And it's like, that's it. There's only 2 options. Ours was monkey bars. And I'm no expert in sort of bones and stuff, but even I could spot that this is the injury here. It's quite easy to sort of see, and we can sort of do something about it, and it's recognized that he has an injury. No one's pretending he doesn't have an injury or complaining that he can't write or do his shoelaces up or anything like that, because everyone knows that he has an injury. It's visible, and he gets lots of nice treatment for it. Whereas relational injuries, not so visible, and often don't evoke the sorts of sympathy that sort of physical injuries can evoke. what they can lead to, I think we've heard quite a lot about it, I think, earlier today around sort of ambivalence. And by ambivalence, I really mean to be in two minds. And that's why I wanted to introduce the idea of internal worlds earlier and relational worlds that we might have. If we've experienced lots of adversity, trauma, pain in our early relationships, we might end up with quite a complicated internal world where I think people have described it earlier, where a part of us, because we are a human being, is still looking for the business of attachment and still trying to connect. But we may have had to develop another part of ourselves in relation to what was going on, a bit like the knives, that now tries to protect ourselves from getting into any other relationships, because we learned early on relationships are bad, bad news. We become deeply phobic of the thing that we actually need for life, which is a bit like a bird becoming fearful of flying. It's that fundamental. To become phobic of connection, of attachment, is massively, massively sort of life-limiting. And as they can lead to an internal conflict between parts of ourself. I put this up because there's not that many places where you get sort of a nice visualization of parts talking to each other, but for any of you who've seen this one probably know this scene. For those of you who haven't, it's from a film called, what is this one? This is Lord of the Rings, isn't it? And not The Hobbit. There's about 10 of these films. They're quite hard to keep up with. But in this particular one, there's a chap called Gollum, and he's two people, really. He's Gollum, and he's Sméagol. And Sméagol is who he was, and to a degree, there was a degree of trauma in his life, and then he developed another part of himself called Gollum. And Gollum is much more sort of antagonistic to the business of connection. Like he's a bit out for himself. He literally goes and hides in a cave. Someone was mentioning caves earlier on. He does actually go and live in a cave and just looks after himself and feeds himself. And by the time we meet him, he's in quite a deprived, sort of neglected sort of state, really. And then he meets a couple of people who sort of make friends with him. And it sort of reawakens this old part of him, maybe recovers this part of him called Sméagol. And Sméagol's a bit like, we should trust these guys. They sound good. They sound good. And Gollum's like, are you mental? Like, we should never trust anybody. Don't you remember? Like, people are bad. But in the film, and it's worth trying to get the clip. I should have put the clip, shouldn't I? Describing it. There's some nice bits where they actually talk to each other. And Gollum's sort of saying, we don't need anybody. And Sméagol's going, well, that's how it was, but it's not the way it is now. And Gollum actually has this lovely line. He says, you need to remember it's me that got us here. It's me that kept us safe. And there's something really important, I think, in that bit of dialogue to talk about the bits of the person that are often very, to use Jade's comment, to be quite knifey, who are could be aggressive or violent or abusive. They may be the bits that kept the person safe. It's a defense against attachment, because they've learnt that attachment and connection and being in relation to people is dangerous, it's threatening, it never worked out well, it's sort of worrying in all sorts of ways, really. And I think that has huge implications for the work that we do in that, and I'll come on to talk about it a bit more later, and if I don't, you should ask me a question about it, and then I will talk about it. But that all the work that we do is at some basic level relational. It's a relationship between a group of people called sometimes clients, patients, sometimes called Bob and Sue and Jack, and a group of other people called support workers or social workers or psychologists or Adam and Peter, all sorts of names, and people in relation to each other. Often there's some sort of visible content that we can see that we're trying to do this, like sort out the person's benefits or get some furniture for their flat or maintain a flat for them. But the fundamental sort of bedrock that sits beneath all of that is this sort of relational contract or this relational experience between two people. And of course, often we're coming into it with an idea of wanting to connect with people, and sometimes we might meet that person, and sometimes we might meet that person. In fact, in my experience, the more you meet this person and the more you make the connection, it's not like this part of the person just goes, oh, fine, okay, you've met somebody nice you can trust now. Lucky you. I'll just down tools and go home, shall I? And just sort of marches off into the distance. That doesn't tend to happen in my experience. In fact, in my experience, the more that you make a connection with the part of the person who has been hurt, who has experienced trauma in that way, the more the defense kicks in. And I think when you work with people long term, there's a period somewhere around, I don't know, it'll be different from person to person, but somewhere around 4 or 5 years, where the person really launches an assault on connection. Says, this has to stop. This absolutely has to stop. It's got to the point where some bit of me is actually believing this might be something. And that I can't tell you how worrying that is, how frightening it is, how uncertain it is, how weird it is, how alien it is, and it has to stop. You have to hate me. You have to get rid of me, like now. And there may be a real sort of assault on the connection to get back to something that for at least a part of the person is familiar and safe, because what they learned perhaps early on is that the safe position is in your room with the door shut, not going to mum and saying, I'm hungry, or I need a hug, or I'd like to talk to somebody, or I'd like to connect in some way. All of those things have been harmed, injured. That's the relational injury that I'm sort of referring to, really, leaving the person to develop other ways of existing in the world that don't depend upon connection with other human beings. As I say, it is like that. It's to become phobic of the very essence of what it is to be a human being, and it's massively life-limiting. I put this slide in at Bob's request. It's just to sort of illustrate something of the sort of invisibility of it, really. This is a picture of a boy surfing. It's not actually my son, although my son did go. See, this is Scotland, and look how sunny it is. Could have been any day, any day. And I took him along to Dunbar, which is just near Edinburgh, and there's some nice coast there, and took him for a surf lesson. He must have been about 12 or something. Dropped him off in the car park, and the guy comes up, real cool dude from Dunbar, like, hey dudes, let's go and do our surf lesson. And so they go down the beach, like about 8 or 9 of them going to have their surf lesson, and I walked up and down the beach for a bit in the sun, and then came back to sort of pick them up. And I picked Jude up, and he'd had a great time, and we drove back to Haddington, which is about a 20-minute drive, and I asked him how it was, because I'd spent money on this. I wanted to know what the outcomes were. And he said, and he started talking to me about it, and he started talking about the content. So he said, we went down to the beach, we had to take our clothes off, and we put the wetsuits on. There was some sand in the wetsuit, and it was a bit scratchy, and then we went into the water, and it was cold, like it was really cold, and the water went in, it was like, whoa, and then it sort of warmed up a bit, and then he told us to paddle, and we got up on the board, and the white water was on our face, and then we went, and then I stood up, and I went, shh, and then I think I managed to surf, because I sort of stayed up all the way into the thing. That was the quick bit. I'll slow down again now. And it was all content. It was all this sort of visible stuff. And what he didn't say was, well, you dropped me off at the car park, and because of the relational capital that I have in my mind, because of the experiences I've had with you and Mum since I was born and with teachers and friends, I was able to trust this man who was asking me to go down to the beach and get into the sea with him. And I went down with him, and even when he asked me to take my clothes off, I was happy to do that and get into the wetsuit, and into the sea we went. And then he gave me instructions, and the only reason I was able to digest those instructions is because I had some trust with him that I learned from you over the years. Like, he didn't mention any of that. It was like it hadn't happened. It was just this invisible thing that he was just some genius at surfing. It was us! But he didn't notice that. So it's really just to sort of illustrate something of the absolute fundamental substrate of relational activity, that it's all education is relational, all healthcare is relational, all life is relational. We can only do this when being in relationships. I think, again, I kind of, one of the words that we use a lot in, not so much since I came around, but one of the words that used to get used a lot was we would talk about people becoming independent. And a big task of support work was to try and get the person to be independent. And it's like, who the hell is independent? Like, I'm not independent. I'm really, really dependent. And I'm really, really proud of my dependency. Like, really proud of it. It's something that I've had to work on to get better at actually being dependent on things and be able to connect to things. I think, well, if you took me and you dropped me on a desert island and you took me away and you actually made me independent, actually independent, like disconnected, and dropped me on a desert island, took away I have to get the order right here, took away my partner, my children, my records, my bikes, my work colleagues, all the other things that I am totally dependent upon, dropped me on a desert island with enough food and water to survive, and then left me there, not for 3 weeks or 3 months, but for the rest of my life. Like, what would it be like? What would it actually feel like to have all of that dependency removed and to become independent? Wonderful. And as the boat sailed away, they said, oh, by the way, there's a bottomless custard jug of heroin at the far end of the Highland. You know, take your time. How long before I was down there, do you think? I give myself like a week. I really think it would be, yeah. Anyway, so psychologically informed environments. Peter's talked better about this than I'm going to. I really just wanted to introduce it as a broad concept, really, that I think I think what it might mean is that we organize our service, organize how we set things up, how we relate to people, based upon as good an understanding as possible of the psychological and emotional needs of the people that we're working with. This is an example of a psychologically informed environment. Has anyone seen one of these before? Yes. They're horrible, aren't they? No, they're great. In our house, we called it the Mind Gym because we're middle class. and I think it said that on the box that it was the Mind Gym. But for those of you who haven't seen one before, you sort of assemble the thing. This is the baby. You remember the baby from slide 1? This is the baby. You set the thing up, and then you slide the baby in one of the entrances, and then you go off and try and sleep for like 20 minutes or half an hour or whatever you can manage, frankly. But on this Mind Gym, there's some interesting things. So it turns out that babies quite like high contrast. Their cortex tends to respond quite well to high contrast. So they like black and white. So there's black and white here. I don't think this bird exists in nature. This has got black and white sort of swirly stomach. There's another panda here. And the other thing that babies like is they like faces, but they like simple faces, just like dots and a mouth. They really respond to this sort of stuff. So suddenly pandas came from like the toy wilderness to being like front and center. Like suddenly everyone wanted, pandas were everywhere. And so I'd say this Mind Gym has a couple of pandas on it. And pandas are just like catnip for babies. Like babies just love pandas. Faces, black and white, brilliant. So this is a psychologically informed environment, an example of an environment that has not been randomly constructed, but has been constructed based upon an understanding of what the sort of needs of its particular clientele actually is. In this case, somebody who's keeping you awake a lot. In terms of how that relates to particular specifics, and I want to talk about a couple of specifics. Just checking that I've covering the bits that I'd forgotten to mention. Engagement. So again, language is one of those things that I think is really, really important, and I have a bit of reputation in the areas I've worked in for being a real pedant about language and the language that we use. But I do think it's important. Bob and I were just talking about it before in terms of, in Britain just now, there's quite a lot of talk around microaggressions, talking about sort of particularly gender-related crime, men towards women, but sort of microaggressions of men sort of wolf whistling or sort of other things like that. And I think language are the sort of microaggressions of this area. There's little bits of language we use all over the place that we might not sort of notice, but actually hold some of our understandings and our thoughts in place about what it is that we're doing. So for example, there might be a difference between the term a person who is rough sleeping compared to a rough sleeper. And that a rough sleeper tells us they're a rough sleeper. And a person who is rough sleeping tells us they're a person who happens to be rough sleeping. It's a subtle difference that when played out over long periods of time, it can actually have an impact, I think. But my favorite word, I've got a couple of my favorite words here. The first one was engagement. We used to talk a lot about people use this word, but usually it meant they weren't engaging. And often there'd be like 7 or 8 people sat around a table talking about the person who wasn't engaging. I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder when the last time 7 or 8 people sat around a table talking about me was. Like, this person really is engaging. They just maybe not engaging in the way we would like them to engage, which is typically more like this. Like, this is the sort of engagement that the health service quite likes, when you turn up at your appointed time and sit in the waiting room, and then when you're called through, you walk through and you sit in the chair and you start talking about your mother and do all sorts of nice therapy, and then we finish on time, and then you go back and you do your homework and you come back and present it next week. We like this stuff. This is good John Lewis versions of healthcare engagement, and most of the health service is set up with this sort of idea in mind, that people are going to relate in this way. Whereas here's Bob, not this Bob, another Bob, and Bob had a meeting with me. We'd made an arrangement to meet, and Bob's engaging with that arrangement by not coming along. Like he's not coming to that meeting. He's missing it. And I'm sitting there wondering where he is. I was sitting at the top of Leith Walk going, I wonder where Bob is. And starting to think about what that feels like to sit at the top of Leith Walk, like a bit of a spare thumb waiting for Bob to not turn up. And I'm wondering, I wonder if he's telling me something about abandonment, or whether he's letting me know what it's like to be neglected, or to be let down, or to not have anybody in the world, just to be sort of sat alone. And maybe it's nothing to do with that. Maybe he was just busy elsewhere, or got caught up in something else. But what's interesting in Bob is that this happens quite a lot. He'll then meet me, and a part of him says, we really need to meet. I've got lots to discuss. But yeah, cool, man. How about next week? I'll be blah, blah, blah. We make a time. Yeah, absolutely. And then I'm there at the top of Leith Walk again, engaging with Bob by myself, because he's not there. He's somewhere else. And I still think this is engagement. This is him engaging in the relationship in a way that might be telling us something about something. And we've heard bits about what that might mean. I do think there is some people who don't engage, like just now, or that we're not engaged with. Just now there might be somebody walking down a street in Tokyo, I assume, it's a busy place, although I don't know what the time is there just now. But let's assume there's someone walking down the street there, and we're not engaged with them. Like we couldn't have a meeting about them. Got nothing to say about that. That's non-engagement, I think. It's where we have nothing to say about anything. But interestingly, we often sit and talk about Bob and go, but what Bob really needs to do is, and the thing is with Bob, and Bob needs to start engaging, and he really needs to address this, and we have these big meetings about what Bob should be doing without really paying attention to what Bob is actually doing. And if we pay attention to what Bob is actually doing in terms of the nature of the relationship that we have with him, it might tell us something. It might tell us something useful about his history, about himself, about his life dilemmas, and about why, at the age of 40, he's still sleeping on the streets, rather than doing the other things that we might consider a relatively sort of healthy lifestyle. My second favorite is multiple and complex needs. Again, it used to be until the language Stasi came in, that's me. Multiple and complex needs was a way of sort of talking about people who had multiple and complex needs. And usually we were referring to people who looked a bit like this, rather than people who looked a bit like this. And of course, if we really think about it, everyone has multiple and complex needs, because we're human beings, and human beings have multiple and complex needs. But a bit like the breathing, if we can do them, if we can get our multiple and complex needs met in relation to the world and to other people in the world, we may not notice that we have multiple and complex needs. So here's these guys. It's a real family. It's just a Google family. Real family. Having their multiple and complex needs met by being in relation to each other, by buying fancy clothes, getting their teeth whitened, by having sex, by having children, by going to the park, by doing all sorts of things, and meeting their needs just like they breathe, just breathing easily. And they're probably breathing while they're doing it, show-offs, just like able to meet their multiple and complex needs really easy by getting into relationship with themselves and the world and all the things in it. Quite the thing. And here's someone else, and they've also got multiple and complex needs, because they're also a human being. But the avenues and the range of options available to them in terms of getting those multiple and complex needs met is limited, has become limited, perhaps because they learned early on that all the things that most other people take for granted, like relational breathing, isn't open to them. The nature of their relational injury meant that they couldn't do that. That's not something that was open to them. So they were left trying to get their needs met, getting in relation to other things. And then one of the things, this makes me think, there's a guy I worked with called Richard who had a nice phrase of, I met heroin at 14 and decided to get married. Which I thought was a really sort of powerful way of describing what he was talking about. That actually this was the first relationship he'd had that really made him feel connected and grounded and contained and regulated, and all the other technical words we tend to use for sort of, we felt all right. It was the time he felt sort of okay. And he thought, is this what other people are like? Is this what they feel like when they're sort of getting the bus and talking to people and doing all these things that take them for granted? And then, of course, quite soon after that, people were trying to get him to stop it. you need to stop taking drugs. And he was like, you're all right, thanks very much. I'll stick with the drugs. Because usually what we were offering him was some sort of relationship, but often not much. We were saying, like, we'd like you to stop this dependency by coming along to the drug service for 20 minutes once a week and talking about some stuff and filling in a drug diary, and then you can go away again. We don't want you to get dependent on us, okay? That's what we don't want. We just want you to give up this dependency. And we weren't really offering any other sort of dependency that might sort of replace it in some way. We never sat and tried to work out what the human dosage equivalent would be of a 10-pound bag of heroin. And I don't know what it would be, but it would be more than 20 minutes once a week, an appointment in a clinic somewhere, I think. I think there's a massive underestimation of the severity of relational injury in a lot of the people we work with, of how life-limiting it is, of how early it developed, of how significant it is, of how complete it is. Like, it might be the complete experience. Again, we talk a lot in mental health services about recovery, and recovery for me means to get back something you once had. I know I've worked with lots of people who I don't think there's anything to recover or that you'd want to recover. And in that regard, the work is maybe more like discovery, to actually discover for the first time that there might be a relationship you could trust or that is safe or that you could rely upon. And I think that's a much, much different piece of work than recovery, because recovery might be able to get something back, whereas discovery is a long, long-term piece of work. I'm just randomly coming up with stories now, but there was, I remember when I was talking about Housing First to the Scottish Government in Scotland, and the example I gave was in terms of trying to get across the dosage and the time with my children. I'm thinking my son is currently 16, and he's had 16 years of Housing First. 16 years of full-time residential care with 2 carers who are relatively competent. 16 years of that he's had, full-time, 24/7. We don't turn our phones off at 5. Sometimes we do. He can still come through and ask us for stuff. And he's still not ready. Like, he still struggles to find his pants in the morning and then sort of get himself organized for school and all the rest of it. And that's coming from a relatively blank slate. He's had 16 years. Now, imagine you then working with somebody who didn't have that, but instead had 16 years of absolute carnage, of complete lack of consistency, reliability, run through with trauma, adversity, anxiety, pain. Like, what would the actual treatment look like if you really wanted to address the severity of relational injury there? Bearing in mind that for a healthy baby, it takes quite a long time to get to the point where you can go off into the world and make connections and live this thing that we call life. I think there's a massive discrepancy based on that and sort of lack of recognition, really, in that, interestingly, and correctly, I think, certainly in Scotland, when people have severe physical injuries, often as a consequence of trauma, like a spinal injury, for example, in a car crash, which is not uncommon, we are more than happy, and rightly so, to spend tens of thousands of pounds and hundreds of hours on rehabilitation and treatment and care, not just in the acute stages of getting the ambulance, taking the person into theatre, doing whatever needs doing. We don't take the person into theatre and go, right, you're getting an hour in theatre, that's it. We'll do what we can, and then that's it. We take the person into theatre and we keep them in theatre until we've done everything that we can do to repair what we can repair. And then afterwards there might be rehab, there might be specialist equipment, physios, wheelchair, home adaptations, all sorts of things. Care might actually be lifelong. And because for some injuries, we might be saying, this injury is very, very severe. You may never walk again. In fact, you're not going to walk again. So we're going to have to make adaptations and accommodations and provide care and input because of the severity of the injury you've had, because of trauma. But when it comes to relational injuries, it's really, really hard to get like 3 hours support a week for somebody. There's always a worry that that's too much, or we don't want to foster dependency, or all sorts of, we just don't have the money or the resources. As I say, as the person is leading a life that is leading towards dying at 38, it's in that language of, well, they're choosing to do this, aren't they? Choosing to take drugs, or choosing to rough sleep, or they didn't turn up to their appointments, becomes the way in which people are excluded from healthcare that might actually be life-saving. And I just don't think we do that in physical healthcare. There's very few areas in physical healthcare where we don't recognize the severity of the injury, whether that's cancer care, whether it's diabetes, whether it's spinal injuries, whether it's other sorts of physical injuries. But relational injury, I think one of the things that underpins it is it's not recognized as an injury. It's not really taken seriously that the trauma is as real and as physical as a spinal injury. It's just invisible. You can't see it, but that does not mean it's not there. I mean, you can see it when the person comes to clinics and behaves in ways that lead to exclusion. So I don't know what a relational injury rehabilitation service would look like. As I say, I've described what our kids had and what a lot of us might have taken for granted. So maybe it might look something like that. I think one of the things we need to think about very carefully, and we can talk about it maybe in the questions, is things like time and commitment. I work in an area where I sometimes see young people who have had similar backgrounds to what I just described, and they might present at the age of 8 or 9, and they're taken into foster care, and then they're adopted. And it's recognized that they will need care their whole life. And their adoptive parents don't say, well, we're your parents for the next 5 years, and then that's it. They're like, no, this is a lifelong deal. But of course, when the person becomes 18, that option closes. Now what they have is you get 3 hours for 6 months, or you get 2 hours a week for 2 years, if you're lucky. 2 years, that's a huge amount of time, 2 years. Well, actually, to address the severity of relational injuries we're talking about, it's nothing. It's nothing. I mean, again, a lady, someone I've worked with for a long period of time, I've known her for a good 10 years now, and some of the first things she said to me were, everyone's an asshole, I don't trust anyone, you know, all sorts of stuff like that. I don't know why I'm coming to see you. You're bloody useless. You're just like everybody else. Blah, blah, blah. Anyway, here we are 10 years later, and occasionally I ask her, because she's at college now, doing really well. She's got her own place, and she was doing child development at college. And in the child development bit, they were learning about language development, and she'd learned that about critical periods, and some of you know about critical periods of development, that if children don't learn a language in the first 4 or 5 years of their life, it will always struggle to learn a language fluently like this. It might always be a second language. And I was joking with her. I said, so where are we with the whole trust thing, you and I? And she's like, she goes, well, I do trust you. But I think I'll always speak trust as a second language. It's like, okay. And that really sort of captures it for me in some way. Like we're 10 years in, and it's still a second language. And it may always be a second language. Like that might be the limits of what rehabilitation in that sort of area might look like. But it's enough. It seems to have allowed her to go to college, make some friends, join a cycling club. I think that's the single most therapeutic intervention I've ever done for anyone, who's build them a bike. And if they get interested in it and get on a bike and get their body moving and see what they're capable of really and start traveling in ways that they haven't moved before. So really there's no such thing as a service user. I said this in 2019, but the astute among you will notice that I sort of borrowed it from Winnicott, just changed a few of the words really. But what I really mean by that, as soon as you use the word service user or patient or client, you're talking about someone else. You're talking about someone who calls someone a client or a patient or a service user. It's a relationship. And that's absolutely fundamental, I think, to the work that we do. And we've touched a bit on this in previous talks, that if you are doing that, if you are going to work in these areas, then it's useful to have some place to take care of yourself. Otherwise, we run the risk of reenacting the very thing that people came looking for help for. And we do a lot of that in health services and statutory services. People do things like show us their adversity by doing things like not turning up or being aggressive, and then we kick them out and label them personality disordered or something in ways that are often a concrete reenactment of the very thing that gave rise to them coming to our door in the first place. So things like, if you're going to pop your, as topical now, very interested in small boats in Britain, just now you've probably noticed. But if you are going to put your service into these sort of relational waters, we need to assume that we will be thrown about all over the place a lot. That if there's one thing we should know about trauma-informed as a concept, is that trauma is traumatic, like by its nature. That's sort of, it's in the title really. And so when we find ourselves in relation to people who've been heavily traumatized, experienced compound trauma, like Peter said, I like that term, we might find ourselves subject to being in relationships that we find traumatic. So we might find ourselves feeling neglected, abandoned, misused, mistreated, hated, all sorts of things. We might even find ourselves hating, feeling abusive towards and uncaring and neglectful towards the people who we're meant to be caring for. And that is completely ordinary. That's the nature of it. I think sometimes there's a big fear that, oh my God, I'm working with this guy and I absolutely hate him. Oh my God, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. As opposed to, well, maybe it's just part of the work that we do, that we will occasionally work with people who will mobilize a bit of us into hating them or disliking them or wanting rid of them. And that's okay, that's very ordinary, as long as we don't enact it. And if we've got processes like reflective practice where we can come and safely think about what it's like to do the work of staying in relation to people who've had really, really crappy experiences of relationships. I think that's mainly what it's for. We use it for other things, but I think that's one of the big things of it, really. Reflective practice doesn't look like this, but I put up to remind myself of the thing that I just said, really, that reflective practice can be a place where we can talk about shocking things. It should be, because a lot of trauma is shocking. We're working with people who had shocking experiences, and we may get to know some of them because we might feel abusive, we might feel hateful, we might feel hated, and we might feel abused. And we need to be able to talk about those things safely. Otherwise, we run the risk of as I say, reenacting the very thing that we're trying to address. I'm going to run through these last ones quickly. I said I'd be quick, and I've been ages. I've got 3 minutes left, I think. So this is, in terms of other places where I think we really need to be more psychologically informed and understand the consequences of relational injury, is in places like services. So this is a picture of a GP practice in Scotland, and helpfully, they've made some adaptation and accommodation for physical injury, as they should. Good. So people who are using wheelchairs can come up here, come in the widened door. There's toilets inside with wide doors and handles and stuff. Brilliant. Adaptation and accommodation for physical injury as a consequence of trauma. But if you go to that same practice and say, where is the adaptations and accommodations for relational injury? Where are they? What adaptations and accommodations have you made to allow people who really don't trust people to come and access your service? And that's much harder to define and much harder to see, and usually it's not there. And there might be ways that we could actually do that, which we can sort of come on to, really. But it's just, again, to articulate that service access is such a big thing, like relational access is such a thing and so invisible. There's so many people who, like, for example, in the practice where I used to work, there was a trauma service, the local trauma service, and at the GP practice where I worked, which is the homeless practice, we didn't get a single person into the trauma service in 17 years. Not one. It's not that we didn't have people who experienced trauma, it's that to go to the trauma service, you need to be able to make a connection with people. You need to be able to trust, you need to be able to go along, walk in, sit down in a waiting room, meet someone you've never met before, go down some stairs, go into a room, have the door shut behind you, and then start talking about yourself. And of course, that is the one thing that a lot of the people we work with, they'd be mad to do that. That would be crazy if they could, given the experiences that they had, they would actually go along and trust people who are inviting them to do something like that, really. It's quite hard to actually find adaptations and accommodations for relational injury even in services that would call themselves trauma services. They will still do things like send out letters to people and say, you need to come here next Wednesday at 2 o'clock and meet someone you've never met before and start doing some stuff. And then when the person doesn't turn up, we'll send them another letter saying, sorry, you didn't engage. We locate the problem into them. And we just wouldn't get away with this in other areas. Like, we would never go to a road traffic accident and sort of rock up to the site where there's people lying with physical injuries, broken hips, and say, you guys really need to get to A&E and get these hips looked at. It's about 5 miles down the road. Go on, crack on. Like, we would never do that. It would be crazy to expect that people with that severity of injury would be able to access healthcare in that way. So we don't. We bring an ambulance, we're very careful, we move them on the thing and put them in the back of the thing and take them along to hospital and treat them and take care of the injury because we can see it. And that's the way it should be. But often in trauma services, or in lots of health services actually, we're asking people to climb relational steps that we should understand they absolutely cannot do. And some of the stuff is like putting a wheelchair clinic at the top of 3 flights of stairs, 2 escalators, and then blaming wheelchair users for not turning up for their appointment, and then discharging them and locating the responsibility into sometimes the most, I think it takes a specially trained mind to locate vulnerability into the most vulnerable members of society. And yet we do it all the time, really. That's the end, really. But I put this cartoon because it's quite funny, but also really just to sort of give that example of sometimes we are doing really crazy things, and yet we locate the blame into the person who needs us the most. Like we do a lot of exclusion based on the way in which the person relates to and engages with and accesses or doesn't access the service. We're quite, I suppose to a degree, health and social care services, at least in Scotland, we're designed by relatively healthy people. So we designed them in our own image, which was like, well, if I was sick, I'd just go along and I'd ask for help, and then when they gave it to me, I'd eat it and say, thank you very much, that was nice help. And we really need to have an understanding that what relational injury is, the real, I think, real fundamental consequence of traumatic experience, is that relational injury that disconnects human beings from other human beings and the world, that the treatment for that is usually not done in rooms in 50-minute sessions, but done in relation to other people over developmental time periods. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And we are all very, very phobic of it, certainly the massively phobic of dependency, I think, in the health service in the UK and social services, really, really worried about it, and fudge it to the point where sometimes we'll extend connections for, say, 2 years, just long enough that the person starts to trust, and they go, right, okay, that's us, we need to end, that's 2 years. That's not psychologically informed. That's not informed by anything other than resource management or what's available to us. Because often with people, what we do there is let that, remember that the 2 people, let that person start to believe and then disconnect. Teaching them really, really fundamentally, you see, allowing the other part of the person to go, see, I told you so. Now you'll know next time, won't you? And that's often the way it goes for years and years and years and years. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Preguntes? Algú vol fer alguna pregunta?
More of that.
En català, en anglès. M'entens si parlo en català? Si hi ha traductor, no? Vale. Jo tenia una pregunta, gràcies Adam per la presentació, per cert, referent a la dependència i el fet de, com has dit tu, que som dependents al llarg de tota la vida. Moltes vegades com a professionals tenim una mica com el rol d'haver de posicionar-nos com una mena de model o com una persona forta per les persones que atenem, quan en veritat tots som dependents i som vulnerables, també la relació amb la vulnerabilitat. Fins a quin punt és més útil o seria més apropiat mostrar-nos vulnerables amb les persones que atenem, o sigui, mostrar que nosaltres també tenim aquestes vulnerabilitats com a mode de connectar millor amb les persones. Seria aquesta pregunta.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yeah. It's a really good question. I think, there's a big answer, I'll try and keep it short. I think the sort of idea that we need to be in some way removed from others as a kind of strong fantasy person who has no issues or problems is, I don't know where that really came from, but I think it was probably always much more about us than it was about the people that we were trying to help. I don't think it stands up to any kind of intellectual scrutiny in terms of whether we're talking about psychological theory, about being psychologically informed. I know as a parent, I think it's really useful at some level to be containing and to be relatively solid, but also to let your children know that you don't have all the answers and that you're not omnipotent and that you're not perfect and that you get things wrong and that you can do things like apologize and that sometimes you get angry and sometimes you make mistakes and that you can go back and say, I'm sorry, I think that was a mistake, and that we can be in relation to each other in that way. I don't know why it should necessarily be different, particularly I think in support work. I think it could be massively valuable for people who've had very limited relational experiences to find out that people who have houses and jobs and friends and money are utterly imperfect. Because, of course, we're all imperfect. It would be, the more I think, it would seem massively counterproductive to try and convey across to people who haven't had good developmental experiences an idea that the ideal is somebody who has all the answers, is never suffers, is completely omnipotent. I think that's a massive mistake. Interestingly, in the UK, I don't know about Spain, that we would have people sometimes who are employed. It's quite an interesting distinction. People who are employed who have lived experience. And of course, they're encouraged very much to sort of share their lived experience with people. But I guess what we know actually within the area that I work in, lots and lots of people, in fact, everyone has had to live their experience and may have something to contribute if they can share something of their own experience with people judiciously, helpfully, in ways that are being thought about. And I think that's where, again, the reflective practice function becomes a useful way of reflecting on where we are with somebody, when might it be useful to share something. But in the broader sort of sense, I think it's always useful to be able to acknowledge that you've made mistakes or that you got it wrong or that you're tired or that you weren't quite there that day, and be able to just acknowledge that that's the reality of it, really. Winnicott had a concept of the good enough mother, which I always thought was quite helpful. It's not perfect. It seems crazy to sort of try and model perfection to a group of people who haven't even had good enough. There's a question way at the back. I can see it.
Gracias. Thank you so much, Adam, for this intervention. Wonderful, I must say. I was really attracted interested in the concept of engagement, since evidently when you ask somebody you are attending to engage, they are engaging with surviving, mostly. So my question is, I find a big gap. Like, I am attending or accompanying somebody, I have like my objectives or what I think it would be good for these people to engage with, like a program, job, etc. But for this person, his own engagement is like to do what he or she knows how to do just to survive. Yeah. So there is evidently a gap. And my question is like, how do you feel this gap? There is a lot of empathy, a lot of trying to understand all the mechanisms of survival, but then what? How do you, should you understand these are their objectives and maybe this person wants to stay living as they live and respect it, so how far you can arrive with your own objectives?
Yeah, it's another really good question, that sort of discrepancy between a sort of almost systemic groupthink idea of what we should be doing and maybe even the tyranny of health of what human beings should be doing, what a good life looks like in some way. I used to use the term, I haven't used it, Raja, but it's something of the way we organize services at times is almost institutionally autistic, which is sort of like we can't conceptualize that there's another mind. Like we've designed it through our own mind, which is, surely everybody wants to be me. You know, and not quite like that, but a bit like that. Like here's an idea of what a healthy world sort of looks like, really. I think it does require, exactly as you described, a real attempt, and I guess a lot of the stuff we've talked about today is a sort of intellectual structures and processes to try and remind ourselves that our mind is not the only mind. There is other minds, and sometimes there are minds who have had completely different experiences to our mind, ones that we couldn't imagine. And I occasionally ask my children, just to wind them up, like, can you imagine what it would be like to never have been able to trust anyone? And they can't. I mean, they can't. It's not possible. They can't do it. They might be able to do it a bit intellectually, but sometimes we're being asked to try and really imagine what it might be like to have grown up where there was no relational object that you felt safe with. Not a bit, but none. And I think there is a distinction between some people who've had nothing, even compared to people who had a gran that they went to every weekend or something to and had some sort of connection with. To answer your question of how to sort of bridge the gap, really, I think maybe I have a belief, and it might be just an overvalued belief, that anybody who we are in connection with, there is hope. And by that I mean I wander around the Highlands of Scotland sometimes, and occasionally you go into a little cottage they call Bothies, and you arrive at like 2 a.m, and there's somebody there, and 5 minutes later they're gone. Like, they're really not engaging. But someone who's sitting on the street in Edinburgh is both in-out, aren't they? They're sort of there, in fact they're hyper-visible. Like you can really, really see them. And yet we often just walk past them and drop money and have 2-minute engagement, and so it's that real sort of in-outness. But if there's in-outness, it might suggest that there's at least a part of the person there that's saying, don't give up. I'm still in here. There's still a part of me who has an idea about something. There's a guy I worked with for a long time, and he had, the first thing he said to me, again, we'd come back to it quite a lot. He said, you know, I don't know why we're meeting up. I died a long time ago. And it was quite a striking thing, really stuck in my sort of head. But I guess at one level, he's telling me about a part of him that's died. But of course, there's another part of him that got up, got on a bus, came along, sat down in a graveyard, and said, I'm dead. So who was that? Because I've seen some dead people, and they don't get up, get on buses, and come and sit in graveyards. They're usually in the graveyard, like 6 feet under. So I'm assuming there's a part of him somewhere that's still interested in the business of living. And I guess we have to house that sometimes. We have to hold on to it. Sometimes in the face of being in relation to the other part of the person who's working incredibly hard to kill us. Not because they're bad or manipulative or not engaging, but because the safest thing that could happen is we could all die and they could be on their own and not have to worry about the business of connecting with other human beings. So I think it's maybe nothing more than trying to hold in mind that there must be a part of the person somewhere who's still interested in the business of living, if you can think about them and if they're in your mind at all. And I think the trick is, how do you hold on to that in the face of the other part of the person who's saying, as Richard used to do, just for, you're fucking crap at this. You're crap. I don't know why I come here. You just say, no, psychology, blah, 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 blah. Like just, like for 2 years, just relentless. Like somewhere in it just kind of, I think you wrote a letter to me once saying, I was really rude last week. I know you won't want to see me again. Like, please, stop. Like this part of him said, this has to stop. But I have to hold on to that. There's another bit of him who's not quite given up yet, you know.
Thanks again.
Was there a question there? Did you have your hand up?
Via Zoom hi havia una pregunta de la senyora Maria, que és veïna de Poble Sec i bueno, traslladava la seva angoixa de quan veu alguna persona dormint al carrer, que què fa? no? Que si n'hi ha prou donant-li alguna de menjar o què fa, no? Es queda una miqueta amb aquesta sensació que no... I ens pregunta una miqueta, et pregunta què faria ella com a veïna.
It's a good question, isn't it? One to get a start. You could think about it on different levels. I don't have a slide in here of social and political determinants that lead to things like rough sleeping, but they're always worth thinking about, because rough sleeping is very much a consequence of the sorts of political determinants that any country decides to adopt, really. The slide was of Margaret Thatcher, but you'll just have to imagine her big smiley face up there. So I guess one of the things you could do is think very carefully about who you vote for and what their policies are, and where they put their money, are they progressive around taxation and about housing and all sorts of stuff. I guess the second thing is you could find out in the local area who are the organizations who are working and doing the work and are skilled and have really good local knowledge, and give as much time, money, resources to them as you want. And then in the moment, I think you don't need to do anything other than you would do to anybody who you pass in the street. You might give a nice smile, a nod, say good morning. If the person's asking for a cup of coffee, maybe you want to get them a cup of coffee. There's absolutely nothing wrong with any of that. But I think it's be ordinary, be ordinary about it, be human, and as I say, there's the other two levels which I think are probably more important. Not more important, but I think it can be very important to think about where you put your vote, where you put your money, who you support in your local community.
Jo no sé si és una pregunta o és una reflexió que penso que segurament l'estic tenint jo i molts companys que estem aquí asseguts. A veure què en penses, Adam, si a Escòcia us passa el mateix. Clar, ens hem passat tota la jornada, no? Que al final jo em quedo amb el més important del que podem fer és crear un espai o un clima de seguretat. No? I clar, i en tot això jo pensava, què passa en aquest sistema en el que els menors que no tenen els seus pares com a referents van a un centre de menors i els hi van canviant els seus nous referents, no? Cada 2 per 3 tenen educadors nous que marxen i altres que tornen. Com poden crear aquest clima de seguretat? Com poden tornar a confiar? Què passa amb persones més grans que ja han viscut al carrer i que el sistema diu avui t'oferim un espai, però en 8 mesos això s'acaba, o en 2 o en 3 anys. No? Realment estem oferint aquest espai de seguretat i més enllà, crítica personal. Quin compromís tenim nosaltres, agents socials, quan decidim treballar en el sector social amb un col·lectiu concret i només provem i marxem. Provem i marxem. Ens parem a pensar què ens passa, què li passa a aquella persona que per fi ha pensat que puc ser permeable i torna a desaparèixer, no? I penso jo en tot això.
Brilliant. Yeah. To take well, they're connected, aren't they? I mean, I think you're talking a bit about relational continuity and commitment across the piece, really. In terms of the idea of safety, I didn't touch on it too much, but I think it's absolutely fundamental. You wouldn't be surprised to hear I think about relational safety above and beyond anything else. We've just started a project in Edinburgh called Relationship First. Catchy, huh? But it's really sort of trying to describe that we might be working with people who, for whatever reason, aren't interested in getting inside 4 walls, but may have an interest in developing a part of them may have an interest in developing safety in connection with another human being. And that becomes very much our focus. I think we have to acknowledge, I think we have to be really, really, really be thoughtful about, again, that's why I think I like the idea of relational injury, of what the severity of the injury is, how much has the person had an experience of anything that's safe, because there may be something qualitatively different between working with someone who's never had any relational safety compared to somebody who's had some, as I say, sort of discovery compared to to recovery. But I think you probably caught in when I was talking, and we haven't got time to get into it at full length, but I do think we massively underestimate what the severity of the injury is at times, and under-resource hugely in ways that, as I say, we would not do within physical injury, spinal injury. We wouldn't repair somebody's spinal injury and then say, right, I'm sorry, you've had 2 years of care, that's it, you're on your own now. Like, there's lots of care that we do that lasts a lifetime. And it may not be with one person, but we know that there's people, for example, who are getting diabetic care or oncology care or heart care, all sorts of care, or spinal injury care, who are in relationship with a service. And sometimes the personnel changes within that service, but that's a very ordinary business of life, and something we do need to be able to learn to deal with it. Some people may come and go, but the service may be committed to the person. So, for example, in relationship first, it may be that the team might change over a sort of 10-year period, but the relationship and the commitment from, say, Simon Community to remain in relation to that person remains. That's the bit we have to take seriously, to recognize that this is not a 2-year project. And actually, I think, as you intimate, that for some people, if we form a connection and allow a little ember of belief to grow over a 2-year period or a 3-year period, and then say, actually, this was just a 3-year project, so you've had quite a lot. You know, you're in a house, we got some furniture, you went to college for a bit, bye. Like, then we completely deny the sort of severity and importance of sort of relational activity. Because it'd be like, we wouldn't do that in ordinary life. We don't do it with our friends. We certainly didn't do it with our kids, where we go, look, I'm your dad for the next 10 years, right? And that's it. You're getting discharged, and I don't want to see you again. Like, it would be crazy. You know, we do so many things in service land that if we did in ordinary land, we'd just be mad from a relational sort of point of view in terms of how we think about things. Who here has gone into a friendship and says, it's going to be about 2 years, I think? Okay, just so you know. Like, we wouldn't do that, you know. And at the endings, we'd have to negotiate and think about and talk about and be aware of. But I think there are things that we can think about at the beginning when we're, I don't like the word, but when we're first meeting people, we might want to try and find out something about their relational history. Are we meeting somebody who has an experience of connection and safety? Or are we meeting somebody who has no experience of safety? Because I think they're different sports, actually, to a degree. And again, we need to think about what is the resource that we have available. If we only have funding for 16 months, we need to be absolutely clear about that right at the beginning. And we need to put the ending in at the beginning and tell people, be really honest with what it is that we actually have, I think.
Moltes gràcies. No sé si hi ha alguna pregunta més. Sí?
Hola. S'ha posat uns exemples bastant clars d'adaptació per quan hi ha lesions físiques, per exemple. Però m'agradaria, saps, per exemple, de wheelchair, no? Si pots posar alguns exemples, quan hi ha lesions relacionals, com adaptar el nostre servei. Perquè potser tots ens fem una idea, però tu potser ens dones una altra pinzellada i fins i tot el convido a venir al nostre servei, aunque no soc director de res, però que és el de sensellarisme, que potser veu algunes coses que diu, hòstia, saps, això no està bé aquí, o us falta posar aigua, saps? O jo què sé, a vegades coses que ens passen desapercebuts, doncs això. Gràcies.
Thanks for coming back to that. I think there's loads actually that I have, and some that we've even sort of tried really. An example, I mean, the starting premise is trying to educate's the wrong word, isn't it? Or trying to inform any particular service about, I guess, the concept of relational injury, that they might be in relation to people who can't do the healthcare relationship well. In fact, they might be in relation to people where the life-limiting condition is the relationship with care itself. That's the thing that's actually causing a problem. So how are we going to set ourselves up to address that issue, which might then allow us to fix things that are fixable, like eczema or COPD or something, to do some sort of medical treatment. So I think there's some quite simple ones like, having specialist psychology services don't discharge someone just because they've missed 2 appointments. Like, really simple stuff. Like, in terms of the letters that we write to people, sort of writing something to say, we know that it might, because some of the appointment letters we write are awful. They're like, you have come to the top of the list, and then in bold, you need to be at this clinic, blah, 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 and then in double bold, if you don't turn up, you will be taken outside, and then triple bold, missing appointments costs money, and like, way to make the person feel like they're a problem, or that they're getting in the way. And of course, for a lot of people, that's very triggering, because they've known they've been unwanted since they were 2 months of age. So in those sorts of services, we might change some of our language in letters to say, we know it can be really difficult to come to places and meet strange people who might ask you about stuff. If it's useful, maybe you want to come sometime and just look at the building and not talk to anyone. Just have a wander around the corridor, or just hang out in the car park for a bit. That's fine. Here's where it is. You know, to really sort of try and midwife the connection, or have some staff within an organization whose specific job is to try and make those connections. And often that is what support workers end up doing. They're the ones who, and nothing, I don't know the Spanish phrase for this, nothing boils my piss more than an idea that support workers' job is just to sort of make the connection and get the person to where the real goodies are, i.e. the psychotherapist or the psychologist in the clinic somewhere. Like, no. The work is that. The work is the support work, is the building of the trust over 5, 10 years sometimes that might allow somebody to come and access a GP. But the GP thing's over in 10 minutes. And great, GPs are brilliant, and they can diagnose stuff and sort stuff out. But the relational injury was the 5 years of work beforehand, which the support work had done. So there's things like, one of the other things we did at a GP practice actually was we had, I don't know what it's like in Spain, but usually when you phone the GP practice, you get into sort of an Orwellian sort of phone system where there's like lots of sub-menus and X, Y, and Z, and it takes about 20 minutes. And most people who I work with would just, well, they wouldn't pick up the phone actually. And so we had a team of 2 reception staff who were just for people where we understood that for this group of patients, the relationship with care itself, I'm using that language because that's the language we used there, the relationship with care itself was the primary medical problem. So sort of actually saying this is the medical problem, is the relationship the person has with care itself. So we need to have something for that. So we had 2 receptionists whose job was just to work with people where it was identified because they'd missed lots of appointment or we knew they had trauma in their history. They would just go, they had one number, and they would go straight through to that receptionist, and they knew the person over time. They got to know the person, and the person knew them. So it's like, oh, hey, John, thanks for phoning today. It's really good to hear from you. How's things? Da, 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 da. And they didn't have to go through the sub-menus and all the rest of it. Now, interestingly, the pushback for that was that, well, everybody would want that number. And it's like, sure. But everybody wants the blue badge that you stick in your car such that you can park right next to the entrance. But not everyone gets it. And they don't get it if they don't actually have need of it. And if we can do it for physical injury, why can't we do it for relational injury? We know that there was quite a small group of people who were really, really struggling to access care, but actually needed care. And it's these sort of dynamics that underpin, I don't know what you call it in Spain, in Britain, the inverse care law, where people who need care the least tend to get the most, and people who need care the most tend to get the least. And it's these sorts of exclusionary dynamics that are part of what sort of underpins that. So there's a couple of examples. They're really not rocket science. Sometimes the things like, just don't discharge. Like we had one of the ways we've flipped on its head was, in one service, we would talk about people who did not attend. So we'd say, oh, they did not attend. So we tried to turn that into, well, what did we not attend to such that they didn't come? So can we start to focus our attention on what went on and look through? And we'd go back and look at the letters we'd sent to people and be like, fucking, I'm not surprised they didn't come. My God, like it's ridiculous. The things that you don't see when you're not looking for them. So sometimes really simple stuff like, but fundamentally some sort of relational bridge. So that might be workers who are dedicated to reaching out and making connection with people, not to do any medical treatment, not to fill in forms or measure their BMI or anything like that, just to make the connection, to be the sort of connection between the GP practice, for example, and the people who need the GP practice. not discharging, dedicated phone lines. As I say, the relational equivalent of the blue badge. I should say, I don't know if in Spain, by blue badge I mean a blue badge that you get such that you can, if you say you need a wheelchair, you have mobility problems, so you can park your car right next to where the door is, so you don't have to walk miles across the car park. So we have that sort of system. So you could have something like that for relational injury. But there's a couple. Oh, there's more, but I'll stop there.
Ja és l'hora. No sé si hi ha alguna última pregunta, però si no ho donaríem per finalitzat. Finalitzat, a la una. Vale. Abans dels agraïments, que no me n'oblidi, que després no escoltarem, abans d'anar a dinar hauríem d'anar a deixar els pinganillos, vale? Que a casa no ens serveixen. I aprofito per agrair a Adam i a tots els ponents per haver-nos dedicat el vostre temps i haver compartit amb nosaltres el vostre coneixement i saviesa. I a la resta ha sigut una oportunitat de parar, escoltar i reflexionar, perquè en el nostre dia a dia no tenim aquests espais i són realment importants per poder millorar. Moltes gràcies.